Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Dave Bambry, and I serve as the president of your University of Illinois Alumni Association. First, I want to thank everyone for joining us this evening. We're looking forward to another great session of our ongoing Alumni College speaker series. Before I introduce our speaker this evening, I want to take just a few moments to talk about some exciting things happening at your Alumni Association. The UIAA is celebrating its sesquicentennial this year, and we're doing that in a number of different ways. One of these, and we just started to communicate about this earlier this week, is we're putting together a time capsule to be opened in 50 years to help commemorate this occasion. We've started to reach out to our alumni to gain your ideas, your thoughts, possibly some of your memorabilia to include in that time capsule. Once we've had a chance to gain some of those thoughts and ideas, we'll narrow that list down and we'll send another communication out to you to vote on your favorite items to be included. This is just one of the many ways that we are asking you to be involved really over the next 8 or 9 months in order to help us celebrate this milestone. We also continue to see great excitement around our annual membership and the premium benefits that go along with that for our alumni that they receive as a part of that program. If you haven't done so already, I encourage you to visit uiaa.org/membership to learn about all of those great benefits and to sign up today. For those of you on the webinar who are life members of the association, please know that you have access to all of these benefits at no additional cost. We're certainly grateful for the investment that you made in that life membership, and we will honor that with our current suite of benefits. We also have some great opportunities for all alumni to engage with us, even if you haven't had a chance to sign up for that membership yet. I hope that everyone on the Zoom knows that homecoming is just a few short weeks away. We've worked extremely hard to bring a wonderful set of events and engagement opportunities to our alumni and friends of the university again this year. And the best spot to go to check out all of that information is homecoming.illinois.edu. We have a week-long set of events here in Champaign-Urbana, with a few of the spotlight events being our annual Homecoming Awards Gala, taking place on Thursday, October 19th. We'll honor 9 awardees this year, and we're really excited about that. We have our homecoming parade that's an annual tradition that will take place at 5:30 on Friday, October 20th, and then certainly the football game against Wisconsin on Saturday, the 21st. Unfortunately, we're still waiting for a kickoff on that game, but we hope to hear more about that soon. Lastly, before I introduce our speaker this evening, I always like to remind everyone to please feel free to submit your questions throughout the presentation. You'll see a Q&A button right at the bottom of your screen there. Go ahead and click on that if you have a question at any point. Type in your question, and we'll get to as many of those as time allows at the end of the program. We have allotted time for that, and we look forward to that discussion. But let's get to why we are here today, and that is to hear from a wonderful faculty member, and it is my distinct pleasure to introduce him here this evening. Ted Underwood is a professor in the School of Information Sciences and also holds an appointment with the Department of English in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. After writing 2 books that describe 18th and 19th century literature using familiar critical models, he turned to new opportunities created by large digital libraries. Since that time, his research has explored literary patterns that become visible across long timelines when we consider hundreds or thousands of books at once. He used machine learning and generative AI to trace the consolidation of detective fiction and science fiction as distinct genres, and to describe the shifting assumptions about gender revealed in literary characterization from 1780 to the present. With that, it is my great pleasure to turn the program over to Ted Underwood. Ted, thank you so much for being here with us this evening. I look forward to the presentation. The floor is yours, and I'll rejoin you at the end. Thank you again.
It's a pleasure to be here. And this is a fascinating thing to discuss with you. I'm looking forward to some discussion. I'll try to leave plenty of time for that. I'm going to be talking and inviting discussion about a range of challenges that emerge when generative artificial intelligence encounters higher ed, students, professors. But I want to start by backing up a little bit from the specific topic of higher education to ask a little bit of, like, what do we mean by AI? What even is this stuff? Because of course, it's not quite what we expected, what 20th century science fiction taught us AI was going to be. whether, it was a Android in the new generation or a ship's computer in the original series of Star Trek, 20th century AI had a particular tone of voice to it. It was often a bit stilted, mechanical. It might be very precise and accurate, 88.3% chance of failure, but confronted by human emotion, does not compute, right? Here in this picture, we see Data trying to paint to understand better what it feels like to be a human being, but that's emotion. Art is a struggle for artificial intelligence. Precision, logic, of course, is what AI was supposed to be good at. However, that's not really what we got, is it? Instead, we got chatbots that, well, they're not infallible. You might, in this case, someone asked them, is 450 90% of 500? And ChatGPT answers, no, 450 is not 90% of 500. To find 90% of 500, you can multiply 500 by 0.9, which gives you 450. Wait, actually, yes, 450 is 90% of 500. My apologies for the confusion. And there's, not infallible. It does manage to correct itself. It has a tendency to think out loud. It may catch its own errors in the process of thinking out loud. On the other hand, these chatbots write beautifully. They don't have that tone of stilted, mechanical, unable to deal with emotion. This is a different kind of artificial intelligence. And when it comes to art, they're often not bad. It's not like Data is sort of struggling to paint. So how did we get on this track? Why is artificial intelligence not looking like we expected? I think it's a crucial question for us to think a little bit about before we launch into questions about higher education, because I think a lot of the debates about how should we be using AI come from differences of opinion about what people expect artificial intelligence to be and to do. And, for instance, if you expect artificial intelligence to look like Data or the ship's computer, what we're actually getting may seem like disappointing, maybe almost a fraud. I think a lot of people feel that we're dealing with something that's kind of a scam that pretends to be intelligent, and it's like the great and powerful Oz. It's a show. I understand why it may seem like that. I don't actually think artificial intelligence is a scam or a fraud, but I understand why it feels like that. Partly because if you've never heard a really satisfying account of what this is and how it works, it's just a black box. I think it's important for us to talk a little bit about how it does work, because when I get around to asking, how should we deal with this in education, if it turns out that this is just kind of a trick, a magic trick, then it's going to be difficult to come up with a satisfying answer. So what I'm going to try to do to start with is kind of pull back the curtain, like in The Wizard of Oz, or take you backstage into the magician's workshop to reveal how the trick is done. And I think when we see that, we'll see that it's not disappointing, that actually how this works is interesting, and there's principled discoveries in there that are worth paying attention to, and that are worth teaching students. So let me talk a little bit about how this is, how this works. To start with, one reason why artificial intelligence isn't looking infallible and logical as we might expect is in the 20th century, that was indeed how we did program computers. We gave them a series of rules that they would follow step by step. And we expected artificial intelligence to look the same way. We expected that we would give it the rules of logic and a collection of facts. And artificial intelligence would be about deducing the consequences of those facts infallibly. But it turned out there were a lot of things that couldn't be reduced to a set of logical rules, like how do you identify a cat in a picture? That's not really a set of logical rules about that. What you do instead is, it turns out, learn from examples. So we needed a way of programming computers that could learn from examples. And machine learning is that way. It's a different approach to telling computers what to do, that instead of giving explicit rules, you give them examples and they infer patterns in the data. So in this image, we have what's called a clustering algorithm. You can sort of sense that there are clusters in this collection of data. There are two little clumps of points, but we don't necessarily know where those clusters are. If you want an algorithm to figure out, one way to do it is sort of randomly scatter the initial centers of clusters and then let the centers be drawn to the center of gravity of all the points that they were assigned to. And gradually the centers of gravity kind of float to the centers of the cluster. And we've learned which points belong to which cluster. Just an example of how you can sort of infer patterns from data. It's not infallible or objective. It will absorb any biases in the examples that it's given. So there critics of machine learning rightly point out, like if we hand it biased human data, it will absorb the human biases. Kind of a side note, for what I do for the history of culture and literature, that can be beneficial because we are interested in understanding the history of human biases. So for instance, if we're studying gender stereotypes, a model that can absorb the biased model of gender in a given period, like in 19th century fiction, is a great thing because then we can compare different stereotypes to each other. But not objective for sure. However, having a mathematical theory of learning, like how you generalize from evidence, is not a cheap trick, I want to suggest. It's actually a really cool thing. Intuitively, we know that when you're learning something, there's an optimal level of abstraction. Like you don't want to get lost in all the weeds of all the details case by case. Because for instance, if you look at the right-hand example on the bottom here of the screen, if you get lost in the weeds case by case, then and you get a different collection of cases, the model, the boundary line that was learned in that right-hand example is going to be too specific. It won't generalize to other samples of points in this difference between the circles and the crosses. On the other hand, you also don't want to be too vague, like the example on the left. There's an optimal level of generality when we're learning a generalization from evidence, and being able to reason mathematically about like what that optimal level of fit or generality is, that's a big step forward. That's not just a kind of a opaque trick. Dwelling on that, because it's going to be the kind of thing that I'm going to suggest students can benefit from. Okay, we have a theory of learning, came together in the 80s and 90s, what we call machine learning. How do we get to generative AI? I want to say, first of all, there's not a huge systematic difference between machine learning and AI. Once you have that theory of learning, machine learning, I think that's the big step toward where we are now. We maybe didn't notice it at the time in 1998 when these things were taking shape, but that was a really important step, learning to learn from examples. The next step to make these models generative and to make them chatbots is teaching them how to work with human language. And that's not terribly complicated. A big part of that is learning how to represent words. If you have a word like queen, we could represent that just with the letters Q, U, E, E, N, but that doesn't tell us anything about its meaning. If we want to understand the meaning of the word, what computer scientists did was they learned to model the word from its context. So like with that clustering algorithm, you could start by just sort of randomly representing each word in a text as a sequence of numbers. And then you would try to learn, you'd mask one of those words, one sequence of numbers, and you'd try to predict what that word was from the other words in the context. And sometimes you'd succeed or fail. But if you gradually adjust the numbers so that you make better predictions from context, you end up with a representation of each word that is systematically related to the others, because that's the way it works best. You're most able to make those predictions. And when you do that, you end up with a set of numbers that represent words that can be understood as like coordinates of a geometrical space. And the words that have similar meanings will cluster together in the space. So like king and queen, they're both monarchs. They're going to be in a similar region of this space. They'll have similar numbers representing them on at least one dimension. So you can do a kind of analogical reasoning, like king is to man as woman is to queen, just in the geometry of this space. That's taking us actually a large part of the distance to where we are now with chatbots. Just learning how to represent words was a big deal. The next step, and I think most people are sort of conscious of this step because this is what got all the press, was to use those representations of words and then train a model that could use the past words in a text to predict the next word in the text. That's all it's doing. It's learning from all these previous word vectors that we've seen in something from the internet or in a book of fiction. From all that evidence, what would probably be the next word? And that's a very simple thing to do. They do it in a slightly complicated way with a neural network, but that's actually not the key part of this. I think it's more learning to represent the meaning of words that was key. If you're interested in the neural network mechanics, I recommend this blog post that I've mentioned on the slide, Large Language Models Explained with a Minimum of Math and Jargon. But at this point, we have a generative model. It can create new words. If you give it a text, it will try to continue the text. It will reason about what happens next. And if you ask it a question, what comes after a question might be an answer. So it will try to generate the answer. This is what we call generative AI. It's not just classifying points, but producing new words. The surprising thing about this, predicting the next word is not, it doesn't seem obviously that great a trick. I mean, you'd expect that would be very limited. But in fact, when you trained a model like this on a large volume of text, it learned not just sort of rules of grammar, but deeper patterns structuring language. Things like this paragraph is setting up a contrast, so there's probably going to be some twist that comes next. Sort of rhetorical and argumentative structures. And in fact, when the model had absorbed all of that, and it was in the weights of the neural network, you could give it new ideas that it had never encountered before, and it would, new words that it had never seen before, for instance, and it would be able to use them. And this was a huge step forward from previous machine learning, where like if you had wanted to teach it what a sonnet was, you'd give it 1,000 examples of a sonnet and eventually it would learn. But then it still doesn't know what a haiku is. If you wanted to understand that, you have to give it 1,000 haiku. You have to give it 1,000 examples of everything you want it to know. And that's limited. What happens suddenly with these models, these large language models, suddenly, somewhat unexpectedly, they were capable of reasoning from just one example, or even sometimes from no examples. So you could give it an example of, say, this word fardaddle. To do a fardaddle means to jump up and down really fast, made up word. But it can come up with a sentence using it in a plausible way because it knows when people jump, how words are used. It's doing something that's a lot like reasoning. And basically, the point I want to draw from this, what's this surprise sort of taught us? Something we kind of knew, but this really drove it in. Language is not just like a mode of expressing thought. It turns out that if you know how to predict sequences of words, you know how to do a lot of the things we call thinking. Not all of them, but a lot of like analogies, extending from one example to another, combining two ideas. Yeah, it could do that because language turns out to be a big part of the way we do that. Like we, to some extent, also think out loud. We use language. So we can sometimes do it in our heads, but a big piece of it is in language. And since I was originally trained in English literature, I will take this moment to sort of celebrate that this is kind of a victory for 20th century linguists, cultural theorists, even wild-eyed French people like Roland Barthes and Michel Foucault. What they all had in common was arguing that language and culture are how we think. They're not just an expression or a dress or sort of inert things. They are how thinking happens. And it looks like from the success of these models, there's some truth to that. Okay, that said, it's not like all the problems are solved. On the contrary, like it's still an issue that these models make stuff up. We've seen it sort of be uncertain about math, but it gets much worse than being uncertain about math. These models will just hallucinate. They will, if you ask them a question about some obscure text that it has never heard of, but you make it sound like it should have heard of the text, it will say, sure, yeah, I've encountered that. I've had it make up all kinds of stuff that it says are in the poems of Percy Shelley that, no, they're not there. But if you ask it, it will hallucinate. That's a problem. We may be able to patch that. I'm sure that Silicon Valley companies are working on patching it. But another thing I'm suggesting is, maybe these models just aren't ultimately going to be oracles. Human beings don't agree on factual truth of all statements. We probably can't expect to have a model that will tell us the truth of everything either. They might be something more like calculators for words. Calculator doesn't have all the truth in it either. You give it some data, it can manipulate the numbers you give it in a reliable way, if those numbers are right. Simon Willison, British programmer, says language models are the same thing. They're calculators for words. Maybe we don't expect it to be the oracle and know everything, but we can give it these documents and say, if you accept these documents as the truth, what would follow from them? Provisional kind of help, not absolute oracle. But there are other issues. These models are not really good at long-range planning. They can't write novels yet, in part because they don't do really long-range planning. They can only think out loud. That's a limitation. There's, of course, a lot of social and political limitations. How does any of this, the books these models are being trained on, do the companies really have the right to train on them? The images? Intellectual property law is not my expertise, and I don't know how that's going to be resolved, but it is a real issue. What I want to say, though, to reassure you a little bit is I think a lot of people have the idea, because progress was very rapid over the last 3 years, one concern that many people have is that very soon we're going to be dealing with AI models that are better than any human being at everything, and we're all going to be out of a job. And one thing I can say to reassure you is I listen pretty closely to the insiders in the tech industry who are developing these models, and they don't think that's, at least many of them don't think that's what's going to happen. What I hear instead, it's like this from Nora Belrose, who works at OpenAI, is that the very rapid progress of the last few years has partly been sort of catch-up growth, because there's this overhang of human knowledge in our libraries and our archives, all of that wealth of human cultural heritage that the models could rapidly, model and learn from. But at some point, the models get to where they're about as good as human experts. And when you get to that level, where are we going to find the data to make them even better than a human expert? Well, not from human experts, right? So it may be possible for them to continue to improve, but it's not likely to be easy or fast. At least that's what I hear from insiders. There may be some plateauing that happens. On the other hand, and here we get to sort of the real theme of higher education, a model that is just as good as a human being or a human expert is plenty good to be extremely disruptive and particular to my own business of education. So what are the consequences for higher ed? Even if these models aren't perfect, they're pretty useful in many ways. Like, as you can probably guess, I'm generating a lot of the images for this presentation using the models. Turned out that being able to model language gave us some leverage on the relation between captions and images. So image models, too, are to some extent dependent on the success with language. I think a lot of what you've probably heard about controversies within higher education has been about questions about plagiarism. Will students just push a button and generate an essay? And that's a real issue. Yes, that is happening sometimes. And when it's happening, students are not learning, right? You don't learn anything from just write me an essay, push a button. So yes, that's a real issue. And I'll talk a little bit about ways of solving it. But I also, the real theme I want to explore here is that a lot of that conversation is kind of professor-centered. It's centered on how education looks if you're teaching the class. And I don't think we've had enough conversation about what students need and what students' lives are going to be like, say, in the 2030s or 40s, what they need to know. So that's where I really want to focus our attention, and I think where we're more likely to get answers about how to deal with higher education, how to deal with AI in higher ed. Let's talk, though, about what we've probably heard about, plagiarism, and so forth. Basically, the reason I call this a professor-centered conversation is because I think it's driven by the understandable desire of teachers not to have to redesign all their courses. I have an assignment on Jane Eyre that's worked well for the past 15 years. I don't want to have to completely rethink the way I'm teaching English literature. Understandable. Although somewhat professor-centered. But let's think about that for a moment. How do we deal with our existing assignments? There are many ways. I think many of them are valid. There's one I'm going to suggest is probably not workable, but the others are probably, they all have some value. The one I think doesn't work is just take the student's paper and feed it into an AI detector and beep. If it detects AI, then we blame the student for having used AI. The detectors just don't work well enough, and they're biased against students for whom English is a second language. So almost everyone that I know who's thought about this says that's not a great solution. There's a lot of disagreement about the other solutions, though. Some people are suggesting retreating to in-person exams. We know if you're using pencil and paper and everyone's sitting in the same classroom, we know you're doing that yourself. That's one solution. Another solution might be to document the writing process, not an AI detector, but some kind of system where students write within an environment that keeps track of their edits and can sort of certify, oh, this edit history looks human. Okay, maybe that might work. We could also not try to keep students from using AI, but teach them how to use the models. And there are a variety of ways of doing that, and I think people are actively exploring that. And finally, there's the possibility that what we really need to do is think about more challenging assignments. Maybe, for instance, AI is not really a huge problem for laboratory sciences, because in those experiments, students are not just replicating some known answer that someone else has written about Jane Eyre. They've been handed a reagent that maybe no one knows except maybe the professor or the lab instructor what's actually in the tube, and you're trying to diagnose what's in the tube. It's a real open question. Similarly, if in the humanities and social sciences, if we give students new evidence like archival evidence or interviews with living people, or maybe expose them to digital libraries on a scale that hasn't been analyzed before, then we'll be asking questions for which there isn't an existing answer, and the models don't know either, right? Maybe that is how we should challenge students, ask them questions for which there isn't an answer yet. That's, I think, a possible live option. But there's some validity to all of these, like the in-person exams, the part of learning that can be done in 2 hours, pencil on paper. They can take care of that part. We also need students to do longer projects that are more like what they're really going to do in the work world, so that they're not a complete answer, but they may be part of the answer. What I really think, though, is that this is sort of not the question that should be completely obsessing us. It's about saving assignments. What we really want to think about, I think, is what kind of lives students are going to be leading in the 2030s and 40s, and what they're going to need to know. And think about it sort of from the ground up, from that perspective. Like, how should we be preparing students for the future? Maybe using existing assignments and some of what we've been teaching, but maybe some new things as well. So just to sort of go over quickly, thinking about it from this perspective, what should we expect? I think it's definitely true still that students are going to need to think and write on their own. So, some of that paper and pencil exam stuff where you've really internalized something well enough to do it completely without assistance, that's still going to be valuable, I think. On the other hand, it seems very likely that most of us are going to be in roles where we are to some extent using generative models, working with them. I just, I run into how do I do this questions every day, whether it's programming or things I see online where I don't really understand. Like I saw something about geology that I asked GPT for. Why is zircon important? And it was helping me explain that. So I think there are going to be lots of occasions where we work with models as advisors, assistants. We may also, though, just as importantly, be creating them or tuning them. If you're communicating with customers and clients, you could write them a 30-page report that they need to page through, but it seems pretty likely that at some point, companies are going to want to prepare an interactive chatbot that can answer customers' questions if we're confident that it's going to do that accurately and in a trustworthy way and represent the company well. And that at that point, it's no longer just you're no longer just a consumer of AI, but students might need to know how to tune it or produce it. Generally, if we are going to be in these roles, if students are going to be using, maybe tuning, producing generative models, we are partially outsourcing a thinking process. And that's not something we can afford to do blindly. Like if we want to claim that we're doing critical thinking, but we're working with models, the only way to do that is to really understand what the model is doing. It's not like a car. Like I don't understand everything that happens in my car, but I know the company does a decent job. I've read consumer reports and this car is reliable. I don't need to know everything about happens under the hood. With thinking, I think it's a little different. It's not enough to be a savvy consumer of a thinking process. You kind of want to know how the thinking process works if you're relying on it. So what I would suggest we need to be thinking about is, what is liberal education in a world that includes machine learning? I think it means preparing students not just to be wary consumers, but to really understand how it works. Enough that they feel confident making judgments about it, being in leadership roles where decisions are made about, should we use machine learning for this or maybe not? Maybe this is something we don't use it for. So that's why I took the sort of detour through how does this stuff work and took you behind stage into the magician's workshop, because I think that's the kind of thing we need to be conveying to students. Things like, this is based on a general theory of learning and how much generalization is appropriate. We have a mathematics about that between sort of getting lost in the weeds and being too vague and fuzzy, we have a way of selecting an optimal level of fuzziness. That's kind of a big thing for them to know. Or, like, it turns out language is really important and is the way thinking happens. That's a big insight that students should feel confident about understanding and mastering. That kind of understanding, it's not just like technical know-how, but understanding the principles behind how machine learning works. I think that's got to be a big part of liberal education in the 21st century. So with that said, I'm cautiously optimistic about where universities are and where they're going. There's a lot of challenges for professors, for students, for the institution. I haven't talked much about research, but research is also part of what we do, and keeping up with Silicon Valley is a challenge. There are going to be a lot of challenges for universities in this. I think, like, I'm actually underselling how much challenge there will be, but I'm cautiously optimistic that there's also a role for us here if we focus on student needs and preparing students, empowering students to think critically about AI, to make decisions about it, and also to know enough about how it works to to look under the hood, so that if they're in a leadership role, they feel confident about saying how it should be used. And I'll stop there. There's more I could say, but let's get there through your questions.
Yeah, it's great to be back with you. Thank you so much for the presentation. I know we've got a lot of questions in the Q&A already. I would certainly encourage folks to continue to ask those as we move forward here. We've probably got about 20 minutes left for the Q&A. As I mentioned in the chat, please feel free to utilize the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Go ahead and type in your questions there, and we'll get to as many as possible. But stepping back a little bit early in your presentation, you were talking about overfit, and I think you described it as underfit and a just right piece there.
Yeah.
We had a question come in about, are there times where that overfit thinking or that overfit situation is required? And they mentioned self-driving cars. So where if we have this outlier, we need to include that outlier in order to keep people safe. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. Yes. I mean, if I'm really gonna be completely honest with you, the truth is that beautiful picture of like overfit, underfit, and just right, kind of, unfortunately, large language models have kind of messed that up a little bit, where it turns out to be beneficial to overfit a lot. And yet we still, the goal is still for them not to memorize things. They should not just be memorizing their training data. They should be generalizing. But the lever has been turned a lot more toward overfitting than we used to believe was possible. Like these models are bigger than we used to imagine would be a good idea. We used to think models this big would probably just memorize everything. But it turns out that we're leaning a bit more in that direction. Self-driving cars I'm not expert in that particular example, but that might be a similar case.
Absolutely. So we had a couple questions come in asking about this hallucination that you talked about, and just wanted to see if you could delve into that maybe for a few minutes a little bit deeper. What are kind of the underlying drivers of that? I think you said if maybe they don't have enough information, that can be something that happens, but what else goes into that? Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, so the underlying principle is that the model sort of doesn't know what fact is, and what it knows is what people tend to say. And so that's, not the same thing. And it's trying to come up with what someone would plausibly say, but that there is no sort of finite record of like all the things someone could plausibly say. So to come up with something someone could plausibly say, it has to be willing to kind of invent stuff. And it's very difficult to know how far to go with that, right? How creative to be is basically we don't want the answer to be not creative at all, because then it will only be able to repeat. So it's a very tricky enterprise. And a lot of what's going on right now in the sort of technical development of models is about figuring out exactly how to adjust that. Empirically, that's the principle of it. Empirically, it is true. Like I've observed, and there's lots of people have observed, and there's research on this, that if you get into more obscure questions, that's when it will hallucinate. Like if you ask it, about some really obscure disease that you think you might have, but it's very rare, or about a book that it might not have seen, then it will be sort of tempted to make something up. Technically, the way to describe this is you've gotten into a low probability region of the space. There are no high probability answers. So it has no good choices. And yet it doesn't know to say, I don't know yet. We're trying to teach it how to say, I don't know. It's getting better at that.
That's a great answer. Thank you. And we have had a few questions about that too, right? Like, how do you know the validity of the answer? Is there anything out there currently that, almost puts a percentage on it, or a level of validity, or is it,
I
this
think
is the answer, or it doesn't know the answer? Is
I
there
think the latest models from, I haven't actually used this function, but I heard that the latest models from Google do try to do this. They do try to put sort of quantify the certainty of the answer. There's also, like when I mentioned the calculators for words thing, another approach to this is not to ever use the models completely cold, like not to ask them, be my oracle, make something up, but to give them stuff. So if you use the models in combination with search, like Bing will do this, and now I think also Google will do this. Effectively, what they're doing is what I described as the calculators for words approach. It will go out and try to find stuff on the web that is hopefully true, like, well, it's on the web anyway. And they do look for sort of more reliable sources, but that's a fuzzy boundary. And then it will take that evidence and try to draw inferences from what it's seen. So it's not as likely, hopefully, to hallucinate. But so that's another strategy. I don't think anyone has solved this perfectly yet. Like the Google strategy of quantifying their confidence, it may be a step forward, but there's work to be done.
You talked a little bit about AI detectors and understanding that, and I guess the lack of reliability with that currently. So kind of a two-part question here. Have you seen that move forward? Have you seen those AI detectors become more accurate as you go? And then the second part of that is, and this is more getting into the higher education piece, are professors saying that students can utilize this, or are they kind of saying it's an all or nothing sort of mentality here? What are the thoughts around that?
So, in truth, what makes this interesting is that there is not a lot of consensus among professors about how to handle this, and there's disagreement. So there are, right now, I would say, students have to kind of go class by class and professor by professor, and sort of like, what are the rules about AI in this class? That's probably not ideal, if I'm being honest with you, but it is where we are right now, because there's just, people have strongly different opinions about it. And there are some classes out there that are saying, do not use AI in this class. And that's the rule for that class. But there are definitely also other classes where maybe someone's saying, it's okay if you use it, but I want to, be honest about how you used it. Or some really advanced classes, the answer might be, it's fine to use it, be cautious and good luck. It's one tool among many. It probably won't be able to answer the sort of advanced questions we're dealing with. So be cautious. But there are different approaches. I think the only thing I could say is sort of like right out, like there's some consensus on not doing this, is the AI detector approach. There has not been much success with it. There's evidence that it's introduces some bias against students for whom English is not their first language. And the risks are really high in terms of like falsely blaming students would really, it's not just the damage to the individual student, but to the climate and the climate of trust. So frankly, like I'm not currently associate dean, but a year ago I was associate dean in the School of Information Sciences. And I did ask my faculty to please not use those because the risk was high.
Absolutely. So we hear a lot, and this is a question that came into us. We hear a lot kind of from that faculty side, that professional side. What are you hearing from students? Is there mixed opinions about their use of AI and how that affects their learning? And are they buying into this, or are they viewing it as kind of the easy button for folks that maybe aren't quite as in that realm? So can you just speak to that for a few minutes?
Yeah. Of course, just as with professors, right, there's a range of opinions. It's not like everyone agrees. But I do hear some agreement that lots of people are using it in one way or another. Like, let's be clear, it's not really easy right now to go to most of the models and just say, like, write me a paper on Jane Eyre with 12 secondary sources. It will make up the secondary sources. It's not really good when you get beyond a couple pages, when you get to like an 8 or 12 page paper, it's going to struggle with that still. So the risk is more in short assignments. It can be really good at the scale of a page or two, especially if it doesn't require secondary sources. At that scale, there are probably there are definitely some students using it in inappropriate ways, and students will acknowledge that. There's also what I've heard is the thing I heard from another professor just yesterday, in fact, who had asked students how they view it. They said, we view it as a safety net, like it can be useful if you need help, but it's also kind of a safety net that's on fire because it may mislead you. It will make stuff up. So it's an interesting dilemma. I feel the same way as the students on that. What I compare it to, not quite a safety net that's on fire, but it feels a little bit like a mentor figure in a folktale that will help you out, like Athena in the Odyssey, or like Merlin or for Arthur or something. It will help you out. It will maybe help you out of a bind, give you an answer, but you can't entirely trust it like Athena. You shouldn't be confident that it's always telling you what's in your best interest or what's absolutely true. So it's an interestingly ambiguous thing. But I do find these things useful, like especially when I have like how-to questions, not really obscure questions like what did Shelley do in 1817? It's liable to make that up if it doesn't know. But if I have a question about how to do something that other people would know, it's a common thing, but like I don't happen to know. That's where it really shines, because you can't necessarily just go to Google and say, how do I connect to this? How do I use this website? I don't understand. There's not always an answer for that, but it's good at condensing the information into instructions.
Yeah, Ted, this may be a tough question, but it seems we have some educators on with us, both in higher ed and earlier on in education, talking about the expectation of teaching this, both in higher education and in high schools and below. What is your sense around where we're heading with that within education? Do you get the sense that there is going to be an expectation that this is taught? And then maybe a second question there, for folks graduating in the next 4 or 5 years, what do you get the sense that they're going to be expected to know stepping out of higher education during that time as well, the AI?
I see one question where someone who's an educator says, I think we have an obligation to prepare students. And I do agree with that. That is our job. And this is the world we're headed for. So whether it's teaching them to be skeptical, that's part of it, or teaching them to understand how it works, that's also part of it. So I do think that's probably true. It's hard to know how that will play out at like the elementary or high school level, because like I say, it's still also necessary. Like, just like we still teach people how to do addition and division. We don't say like the calculator is going to do that for you. It matters that they know how that works. I think that's absolutely also going to be true with writing. We're probably not going to want high school students to be relying super heavily on a model that they're going to struggle to understand. So I don't know at the high school level, but there's probably some limit on how much students should use it, even if we are responsible for preparing them. I'm sorry, I forgot the second part of your question. It was
just based around really what do you see as kind of the short-term expectations of folks graduating in the next 3 or 4 years? What will employers, what will the world expect that they know coming out already? Do we have a sense of that at all?
I think expect would be too strong a word, because we're all still struggling. Like even people who are working in this area, even CS professors are struggling to keep up with this. So it's not like there's an expectation that we all know pretty much anything about this because we're all playing catch up. But I do think, I would say it is likely to help students if they, like I would say what I would recommend, like if I had a child who was going into college now, or a sophomore in college, I would recommend that they take a course in statistical learning. It's like the introduction to machine learning, to get kind of some of the things I was talking about, the basic, almost philosophical underpinnings of what this is and how it works. I think that immediately gives you a lot of confidence about understanding when it goes wrong, like why it's going wrong and how it will go wrong in that way. And it's just likely to be valuable, not just in the short term, but in the long run, because it's really understanding what this stuff does.
Yeah, so Ted, we've gotten a few questions related to folks that maybe don't have quite as much experience in the AI space, and as you mentioned, everyone is playing catch up, and some of us, like myself, are playing even more catch up. So, are there sections or areas that you would say folks shouldn't use AI for, or that it's further along with than maybe in other areas of study or the world? Do you have a sense of that at all?
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I really, I'm very empathetic with, like I say, my degree is in English literature, so it's been a journey for me, and it's not like these models are being widely used in English departments right now. There's that's going to take a bit, and I think probably it would be like for creative writing. It's really limited what these models can do for us in creative writing. There's, people are going to play with them, and that will be a kind of a gimmick. If I'm being honest, that some books will probably be sold that way, and they may be interesting, but like if I was a novelist, I would not feel at all that I'm falling behind if I don't use these models. They're not good at that yet. They're very limited in that space, partly because they're not good at plot. They can't plan long range very well yet. So, it's not like everyone should feel anxious that they need to be using this stuff, because there definitely are areas where the models just are not that great.
Absolutely. So kind of, I guess, not necessarily staying in that realm, but when it comes to parameters a bit and scaling, are there any laws in place or anything that we're seeing around the evolution of AI and where it can and can't be used in potentially dangerous situations? Even can you talk about that a bit, and if that's been
that is going to be a huge political controversy, and it's already played out in Europe. They did, I believe, or are in the process of passing some laws to regulate, like register models actually have to be registered is the proposal in Europe. It's a little bit like having to register a printing press, in my opinion. Like I'm not sure that I'm entirely comfortable with the idea that these have to be registered with the government, but that is the path they're taking in Europe, and there are going to be similar proposals here for sure. They're already taking shape in the Senate, and I don't have, that's a political question. I don't have expertise about it. There's going to be a disagreement about what path we should take, but it seems very likely that politics and law will play a role in how these evolve. And that's part of the reason why I think the sort of fantasy of a world where there's lots of autonomous, super intelligent programs running around is not it's not super likely, because I just don't think the political system will go for that. For one thing, like, who has legal liability? If a company makes an autonomous program, who's liable for its actions? That's not going to be an easy question to answer. So I don't have an answer for that, except to say that, like, yeah, politics and law are going to be a big part of how this evolves.
Yeah, absolutely. And with ChatGPT, my understanding is that is kind of considered an open AI at that point, right? So folks are contributing from everywhere. How does that, is that happening in other spaces? That seems like kind of a new way of doing business, for lack of a better term. Can you just kind of speak to that model a little bit? And
yes, this is tricky. In spite of the name OpenAI itself is not really very open. Like, they're not even really publishing papers about how they do stuff anymore. They kind of stopped doing that because it's gotten too valuable. They don't want competitors to know. There are, however, some open models out there, like Meta, Facebook, has actually been releasing a lot of open models that anyone can use. They're not quite as big or as quite as powerful as the Google and OpenAI models, but they are, something that we can use and adapt and train and tune. And that's going to be really interesting. The part of the reason I'm a little bit worried about the approach of sort of regulating this industry is there's a little bit of danger that doing that ends up clamping down on the open side, the models that anyone can sort of have and use, whereas the big players, they do everything in secret anyway, and the regulations may not really affect what they're doing. Whereas if we're trying to construct these models openly, and then we have to be able to share the data, we have to say what we're doing. So the laws would have maybe a bigger impact on academics than on Google or OpenAI. Is the risk there?
Yeah, Ted. So we've had a few questions come in, and I think with the pace that this is all moving, AI in general, it's probably an unfair question. But if we're sitting here a year from now, or the question was 5 years from now, but I'm going to scale it back a little bit because of how things are moving here. What are some things you expect to see over the next year or two within the AI space, and what can we kind of see on the horizon here?
One thing we will definitely see is the voice assistants like Siri and Alexa are going to get a lot smarter. They're behind everything else right now, but Apple is working on it and Amazon is. That will definitely happen in the next year. Also, continuing development of multimodal, in other words, vision as well as language. That's really already happening. I'm not even really predicting something. Like they can already look at your bicycle and say, you need to flip that lever and read your instruction manual. You can take a picture of the instructions and send it to the model. So those will definitely be things that happen. Probably also some kind of integration, like companies are going to want to integrate this with your email so that it can read your email and summarize it for you. The voice assistants will probably be able to do that. Those are some of the obvious low-hanging fruit for the companies to get.
Yeah. And I was going to end on that question. I think it was a good thing to do, but we just had one come in that I think is interesting. It's very timely. The recent Hollywood writers' strike wanted limits on the use of AI. The person who wrote in asked, is this a realistic fear that AI would take over the creative jobs? Or was there a different fear that they had in that space?
That's a really interesting question, and I did watch that closely. I think the fear wasn't so much that AI was going to do the whole thing, but that AI would do parts of the process and that the studios would use that to reduce the control and money that the writers had. So kind of a lever. And my understanding of the outcome of the strike was they didn't forbid writers from using AI, but they set a bunch of rules so that basically AI can't get the credit. It can't be the source material, and we can't be viewed just as the editor of the source material. We have to have credit. And it's in some ways, it seemed to me kind of promising in that it didn't try to make an absolute ban, but it tried to ensure that writers would have some say over how the stuff was used. And that could be a promising compromise.
Absolutely. Well, Professor Underwood, thank you. We're at the hour mark. I want to be respectful of everyone's time here on the call tonight. We have a football game that a lot of our Chicagoland folks may be interested in on the Zoom tonight as well. So I certainly don't want to keep folks from that. But again, thank you. We've got a ton of other questions. We could have stayed a lot longer. Maybe we'll have to do a follow-up from now. Maybe it'll be in a year or two and we can see what our projections are like. But again, thank you, Professor Underwood, for your time. It was absolutely a fascinating conversation. We greatly appreciate it. And thanks to all of you for joining us this evening. We hope that you enjoyed it. We hope you come back and join us for another speaker series session in the future. Please keep an eye on your email. We have another session coming up in November that is on healthy aging. So if that's a topic that you would like to hear more about, we would certainly welcome you as a part of that session as well. And we hope that you'll join us for homecoming, whether you're in Champaign-Urbana or engaging with us on social media from around the world. We hope that you'll be a part of homecoming here at Illinois. It's a great tradition and something that we look forward to every year. But thank you all again for joining us. I hope you have a wonderful evening, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.